The night of July 10th, 1806, was heavy with the stifling heat of the Tamil Nadu summer. In the Carnatic region of southern India, the granite walls of Vellore Fort stood silent against the dark sky, imposing and seemingly impenetrable. Surrounded by a deep moat infested with crocodiles, this fortress was the linchpin of British authority in the south, a symbol of the East India Company's domination over the subcontinent. Inside the massive stone ramparts, the air was still, broken only by the rhythmic footsteps of the sentries and the distant, unsettled murmur of the wind. The British garrison, comprising 4 companies of His Majesty's 69th Regiment of Foot, lay asleep in their barracks. They were roughly 370 men, many of them suffering from the local fevers, exhausted by the climate, and utterly unaware that they were resting in the centre of a kill box. But outside the barracks, the silence was a deception. In the shadows of the parade ground and near the magazines, 1,500 Indian sepoys from the 1st and 23rd Madras Native Infantry were silently gathering. These were men who had served the company loyally, trained in British drill and discipline, but tonight their allegiance had shifted. Simmering beneath the surface was a deep cultural resentment, ignited by the harsh new regulations of Sir John Cradock, the Commander-in-Chief of the Madras Army. The order to shave their beards, remove their caste marks, and wear a new, round hat with a leather cockade, resembling the European Christians, had been interpreted not just as a change in uniform, but as a forced conversion and an erasure of their identity. The sepoys believed they were fighting for their souls, and watching from their princely confinement within the fort were the sons of the late Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, the fallen enemy of the British Empire. Their presence turned a military grievance into a potential dynastic restoration. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the tension finally snapped. There was no shouted warning, no bugle call to alert the defenders. The mutiny began with the sudden sharp crack of musketry that shattered the night. The sepoys did not attempt a traditional open-field engagement. Instead, they executed a brutal, tactical ambuscade. They surrounded the barracks of the 69th Regiment, bringing their Brown Bess muskets to bear on the open windows and ventilation slats. The British soldiers woke to a nightmare of smoke and lead. Before the men of the 69th could even roll from their cots or reach for their weapons, volleys of musket balls tore through the sleeping quarters. The barracks became a trap. The narrow windows, designed to let in air, now let in death, while the sturdy walls that were meant to protect the soldiers prevented them from returning fire or identifying their attackers. Confusion reigned supreme. The soldiers, disoriented and dressed only in their sleeping clothes, scrambled for cover as the wooden frames of the windows splintered under the relentless fusillade. The smell of black powder quickly filled the enclosed spaces, choking the survivors and adding to the terrifying sensory overload of the ambush. Hearing the commotion, the fort's commander, Lieutenant Colonel St. John Fancourt, was roused from his sleep in his quarters nearby. Believing the noise to be a minor disturbance, or perhaps a drunken brawl among the men, he donned his dressing gown and stepped out into the humid night to restore order. It was a fatal miscalculation. As he emerged, he was met not by unruly soldiers, but by a disciplined firing squad of mutineers. Fancourt was struck almost immediately, a casualty of the very men he commanded. He managed to stagger back toward his home, mortally wounded, leaving the garrison headless in the opening minutes of the insurrection. Simultaneously, the mutineers moved to secure the fort's strategic points. The main guard was overwhelmed, the sentries bayoneted at their posts. The sepoys seized the powder magazine, ensuring they had an unlimited supply of ammunition while the British defenders were scavenging for rounds. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the East India Company's control over Vellore Fort had effectively collapsed. The 69th Regiment was trapped, their commander was dying, and the flag of the British Empire was about to be hauled down. In the darkness, the sepoys began to unfurl a new standard, one that had not flown since the fall of Seringapatam 7 years prior, the striped flag of the Tiger of Mysore. The mutiny was no longer a protest, it was a revolution. Inside the smoke-choked barracks of the 69th Regiment, the situation had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The initial volley of musket fire had decimated the ranks of the British infantry, leaving the floor slick with blood and cluttered with the bodies of the dead and wounded. The surviving officers and non-commissioned officers, realizing that staying inside the wooden buildings meant certain death, made a critical decision. They had to break out. Amidst the deafening roar of the sepoys' muskets and the screams of their dying comrades, the remnants of the 69th rallied. Clutching their Brown Bess muskets, many of which were unloaded as their ammunition pouches lay out of reach in the chaos, they fixed bayonets. With a collective surge of adrenaline, they burst through the doors and windows, charging into the courtyard. The transition from the enclosed barracks to the open air of the fort offered little relief. The courtyard was a killing ground, swarming with mutinous sepoys from the 1st and 23rd Native Infantry, who poured fire into the disorganized redcoats. However, the discipline of the British Line Infantry, drilled into them through years of harsh training, began to take hold. Acting on instinct, the survivors fought their way toward the stone steps leading up to the ramparts. The walls of Vellore Fort were massive, built of heavy granite blocks, offering the only defensible high ground within the complex. If they could reach the bastions, they might hold out. If they remained on the ground level, they would be slaughtered to a man. A small group of officers and men, numbering perhaps 200 effectives, managed to claw their way up the narrow stairs to the ramparts. There, they established a precarious defensive line. They crouched behind the stone parapets, using the architecture of the fort itself as a shield against the sniper fire coming from the courtyard below and the surrounding buildings. Yet, their position was dire. They were cut off from the magazine, meaning they had almost no ammunition. Most soldiers had only the few rounds they had managed to grab in the dark, or whatever they could scavenge from the fallen. For the next several hours, the defense of Vellore would rely not on firepower, but on the cold steel of the bayonet and the sheer refusal to break. As dawn broke over the Carnatic, the full scope of the disaster became visible. The rising sun illuminated a scene of carnage below. The mutineers, emboldened by their initial success and the paralysis of the British command, were now fully in control of the fort's interior. They broke open the treasury and the stores, looting the company's wealth. More ominously, the political nature of the uprising was revealed for all to see. From the princely quarters, the sons of Tipu Sultan, Fateh Haidar, and Muiz ud-Din emerged to witness the collapse of their captors. Their servants were seen distributing sweetmeats and water to the mutinous sepoys, encouraging them to finish the job. And then, in a moment that sent a chill through the exhausted defenders on the walls, the Union Jack was struck from the flagstaff. In its place, rising slowly against the morning sky, was the tiger flag of Mysore, a centre field of stripes, the emblem of the old regime. The British were no longer just fighting a mutiny. They were witnessing the resurrection of an enemy state. However, amidst the chaos of the early morning, one officer had managed to slip through the net. Major Coots, an officer of the Madras Army who happened to be outside the fort when the firing began, realized that the garrison was doomed without immediate reinforcement. He did not attempt to enter the death trap of the fort. Instead, he turned his horse away from the sound of the guns and drove his spurs into the animal's flanks. The nearest significant British force was stationed at Arcot, 16 miles away. Cootis rode like a man possessed, tearing across the dusty plains of Tamil Nadu. Every minute wasted was another minute the 69th spent under withering fire without ammunition. The heat of the day was beginning to build, the sun baking the dry earth. But Cootis pushed his mount to the limit. He carried with him the news that would shock the empire. Vellore had fallen, the tiger was rising, and the British Army in India was facing its darkest hour. His destination was the headquarters of the 19th Light Dragoons, and more importantly, the quarters of a man known for his reckless bravery and decisive speed, Colonel Rollo Gillespie. At the cantonment in Arcot, the morning of July 10th, began with the leisurely pace typical of a peacetime garrison. It was shortly after 6 o'clock, and Colonel Rollo Gillespie was awake, preparing for a journey to Madras. A man of fiery temperament and immense physical courage, Gillespie was already a legend within the ranks, a soldier who had once killed a man in a duel and fought across the West Indies before coming to India. He was mounting his horse for a morning ride when a dust cloud on the horizon signaled the approach of a frantic rider. It was Major Coots, his uniform stained with sweat and road dust, his horse foaming from the brutal 16-mile sprint from Vellore. As Coots pulled his exhausted mount to a halt, the news he delivered shattered the morning calm. There was no need for a formal briefing or a council of war. The urgency in Coots's demeanor told the story. The native troops had risen, the British garrison was being slaughtered, and the fort was in the hands of the Mysorean princes. For Gillespie, the strategic nightmare was immediately apparent. If Vellore held out for even a day, the thousands of demobilized soldiers of Tipu Sultan's former army, currently scattered across the countryside, would flock to the Tiger banner. The mutiny would become a general war. Gillespie's reaction was instantaneous. He did not wait for written orders or permission from Madras. He roared for the trumpet to sound, "Boots and saddles." The 19th Light Dragoons, one of the few King's regiments of cavalry in India, scrambled into action. These were elite troopers, men who fought with the sabre and rode with a precision that was the envy of the service. Within minutes, a squadron of the 19th, along with a troop of the 7th Madras Cavalry, native soldiers who remained loyal despite the mutiny of their infantry counterparts, were mounted and formed up. Gillespie, however, knew that cavalry alone could not breach a fortress gate. He ordered the galloper guns, light 6-pounder field cannons pulled by teams of horses, to follow at their best speed. But he would not wait for them. Time was the enemy now, as much as the mutineers. With a small advance guard of troopers, Gillespie spurred his horse onto the road to Vellore, leaving the main body of the cavalry to follow in his wake. The ride that followed became the stuff of military legend. The 16 miles between Arcot and Vellore is a flat, dusty stretch of the Carnatic plains. Under the rapidly climbing sun, the heat began to shimmer off the hard-packed earth, but Gillespie set a punishing pace. The horses, pushed to a full gallop, thundered down the road, kicking up clouds of choking dust that coated the riders' uniforms. Gillespie, driving his mount relentlessly, rode well ahead of his own men, his mind focused entirely on the timeline of the massacre occurring up the road. He knew that every minute the 69th Regiment spent pinned on the walls without ammunition reduced their numbers and their morale. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the walls of Vellore Fort loomed into view. Even from a distance, the situation was visibly desperate. The sound of sporadic musket fire drifted across the plain, a popping crackle that signified the fight was still ongoing. But as the cavalry drew closer, the visual confirmation of the disaster struck them. Flying defiantly from the heavy stone ramparts was not the Union Jack, but the striped flag of Mysore. The sight of the enemy standard enraged the dragoons, confirming that this was no mere riot. Gillespie did not slow down to reconnoitre. He rode straight for the outer defences. The fort was surrounded by a massive wet ditch, a moat filled with dark water and notorious for its crocodile population. The drawbridge was down, and the first 3 gates of the complex were open, left unguarded by the mutineers, who were too focused on looting and killing the survivors inside to secure the perimeter. Gillespie and his advance guard thundered through the outer defences, their hooves clattering loudly on the stone causeways. They passed through the first gateway, then the second, then the third. But as they rounded the final bend toward the 4th and final gate, the entrance to the inner fort where the 69th was trapped, they found it shut fast. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron studs, barred their path. Behind those doors lay the courtyard, the mutineers, and the dying remnants of the garrison. Gillespie reined in his horse in the narrow killing zone between the gates. He was agonizingly close, yet completely cut off from the men he had ridden so hard to save. Trapped in the narrow confines between the 3rd and 4th gates, Colonel Gillespie and his small party of dragoons were in a precarious position. They were essentially sitting ducks, squeezed into a stone corridor where maneuverability was impossible. From inside the fort, the mutineers could sense the arrival of the relief force, and the intensity of the fire directed at the ramparts increased. High above the locked gate, on the stone bastion overlooking the entrance, the survivors of the 69th Regiment peered over the parapet. Their condition was wretched. They had been fighting for over 7 hours in the sweltering heat, many clad only in their nightshirts, their lips cracked from dehydration, and their faces blackened by gunpowder soot. Worst of all, their pouches were empty. The last of their ammunition had been spent holding back the sepoys, and some men had resorted to loading their muskets with buttons or small stones in a desperate bid to keep the enemy at bay. When the soldiers on the wall looked down and recognized the uniform of the 19th Light Dragoons, a ragged cheer went up, but it was quickly stifled by the reality of the locked gate. They had no keys, and the mechanism was controlled from the inside, currently held by the mutineers. The cavalry could not get in, and the infantry could not get out. The morale of the 69th was teetering on the brink of total collapse. Without immediate leadership, the exhausted men were liable to surrender or be overrun by the sheer numbers of the sepoys massing in the courtyard. It was at this moment that the siege of Vellore produced its most cinematic image. Colonel Gillespie, realizing that the gate would not open and that his men below could do nothing until the artillery arrived, decided he had to reach the ramparts himself. He dismounted, handing the reins of his charger to a trooper. Above him, the soldiers of the 69th hastily knotted together a makeshift rope. Some accounts suggest it was formed from their crossbelts and sashes linked together, and lowered it down the sheer face of the granite wall. Disregarding the sniper fire that zipped past the stone, Gillespie grabbed the leather strap. In a display of physical prowess that defied his rank and the oppressive heat, the colonel hauled himself hand over hand up the high wall. As he crested the parapet and vaulted onto the rampart, the effect on the defenders was electric. Here was not just an officer, but a warrior of legendary reputation, appearing almost magically in their midst. Gillespie did not bring ammunition or water, but he brought something arguably more vital: command presence. Drawing his sword, he immediately took charge of the disorganized remnants of the 69th. He ordered them to form up with their bayonets, positioning them to cover the gate below and preventing the mutineers from reinforcing the entrance. The mere sight of Gillespie on the walls stopped the men from wavering. The panic that had threatened to consume the garrison was replaced by a steely resolve to hold on for just a little longer. While Gillespie rallied the infantry on the heights, the sound of iron wheels grinding against stone signaled the arrival of the heavy hitters. The galloper guns, the horse artillery that had been trailing the cavalry, finally reached the outer perimeter. These light 6-pounder cannons, drawn by teams of sweating horses, navigated the outer gates and rumbled into the position Gillespie had vacated. Under the direction of the artillery officers, the gunners unlimbered the cannon directly in front of the massive fourth gate. The space was tight, the range point blank. The gunners worked with practiced efficiency, swabbing the barrel and ramming home a charge of powder and shot. Above them, Gillespie directed the 69th to suppress any sepoys attempting to fire down on the artillery crew. The timeline had compressed to seconds. The mutiny had started in darkness, but it would be decided in the blinding light of noon. The fuse was lit. The gunners stepped back, and the British counterattack was ready to transition from a desperate defense to a violent breach. The explosion was deafening, magnified by the stone acoustics of the tunnel-like entrance. The 6-pound shot, fired from only yards away, slammed into the center of the heavy wooden gates with irresistible kinetic energy. The ancient timber, reinforced with iron bands, shattered instantly. Splinters the size of javelins were hurled into the courtyard beyond, and the massive doors were blown off their hinges, collapsing inward in a cloud of dust and pulverized masonry. For a brief second, a stunned silence hung over the fort, the ringing in the ears of the combatants drowning out the cries of the wounded. But the silence was immediately filled by a sound far more terrifying to the infantry standing in the open square: the roar of a cavalry charge. The smoke from the blast had not yet cleared when the 19th Light Dragoons launched their attack. Moving as a singular, disciplined organism, the squadron spurred their horses forward. They thundered over the debris of the broken gate, their horses leaping over the shattered timbers and the bodies of sepoys caught in the blast. The transition from the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel to the wide expanse of the parade ground was instantaneous. This was the moment of maximum danger for the cavalry. Emerging one by one, or in twos, they were vulnerable to massed musket fire before they could deploy. However, the shock of the breach had paralyzed the mutineers. The sepoys, who had spent the morning hunting the survivors of the 69th Light game, suddenly found themselves the prey. Before they could reform their lines or reload their muskets to face this new threat, the British cavalry was upon them. The dragoons, experts in horsemanship, executed a difficult tactical maneuver under fire. Fanning out from the gate with practiced speed, they expanded from a narrow column into a sweeping battle line, their curved sabres drawn and flashing in the high noon sun. The psychological impact of heavy horses charging within the confined walls of a fortress cannot be overstated. The parade ground, usually a place of drill and order, became a chaotic arena of slaughter. The 19th Light Dragoons rode through the sepoy ranks, using the height and weight of their mounts to crush resistance. The sabres rose and fell with grim mechanical efficiency. The sepoys, trained to fight in rigid lines against other infantry, had no defense against cavalry operating in their rear and flank. Discipline evaporated. The cohesive units of the 1st and 23rd Native Infantry disintegrated into a panicked mob, scrambling for safety that no longer existed. From the ramparts above, the exhausted survivors of the 69th Regiment witnessed their salvation. Seeing the cavalry sweep the square, the British infantry found a reserve of strength. With Colonel Gillespie leading them, or perhaps directing them, accounts vary, but his spirit drove them. They abandoned the safety of the walls. With bayonets fixed to their empty muskets, they charged down the stone steps to join the fray on the ground level. The hunters became the hunted. The British soldiers, fueled by hours of terror and the sight of their butchered comrades in the barracks, showed no mercy. The engagement ceased to be a battle and devolved into a rout. The sepoys, trapped between the high walls they had seized and the cavalry that now owned the courtyard, had nowhere to run. The tiger flag, which had flown so triumphantly only hours before, now looked down upon the destruction of the army that had raised it. By midday, the tactical situation inside Vellore Fort had shifted from a contest of arms to a systematic purge. The 19th Light Dragoons, having broken the back of the resistance with their initial charge, now patrolled the interior of the fort, hunting down pockets of mutineers who had fled into the labyrinth of buildings, storerooms, and narrow alleyways. The sepoys who had initiated the mutiny with such precision in the dark were now scattered and leaderless in the light. The breakdown of command among the rebels was absolute. Without the unifying voice of their officers, whom they had killed or driven off, and with the Mysorean princes remaining largely passive in their quarters as the tide turned, the sepoys were left to fend for themselves against a vengeful enemy. The fighting that continued was brutal and close quarters. The 69th Regiment, now on the ground and moving in grim packs, cleared the barracks where they had been ambushed hours earlier. The scene they returned to was horrific. The bodies of their messmates lay where they had fallen, riddled with musket balls in their sleep. This sight stripped away any inclination toward leniency. Bayonets were used freely. The sepoys, cornered in dead ends or attempting to hide in the magazines, were flushed out and cut down. The crack of pistols and the clash of steel echoed off the granite walls, intermingled with the shouts of men pleading for quarter and receiving none. Colonel Gillespie, having secured the main gate and the parade ground, turned his attention to re-establishing total control. The galloper guns were brought fully into the fort, their muzzles trained on the main thoroughfares to prevent any counter-rally. But the resistance was largely spent. The mutineers' morale had shattered the moment the gate was breached. Hundreds of sepoys attempted to escape the carnage by scaling the walls or squeezing through the sally ports, only to be ridden down by the cavalry acting as a cordon outside, or picked off by the marksmen of the 69th who had reoccupied the ramparts. The death toll rose rapidly. In the span of an hour, the interior of Vellore Fort was transformed into a charnel house. While exact numbers vary, it is estimated that between 300 and 800 sepoys were killed in the fighting or the immediate aftermath. The drainages of the fort ran red, staining the dust of the parade ground. The British losses were also severe, though lighter in comparison to the slaughter of the rebels. Roughly 130 men of the garrison had been killed or wounded, most of them in the initial surprise attack at 2 a.m. As the dust settled and the screams faded, the British troops turned their eyes toward the princely quarters. The sons of Tipu Sultan, Fateh Haidar and Muiz ud-Din were discovered cowering in the palace within the fort. They had provided the spark and the symbol for the uprising, allowing their father's flag to be raised, yet they had failed to lead the troops when the battle turned against them. They were immediately placed under heavy guard. Though they were not executed on the spot, their royal blood offering a sliver of diplomatic protection that the common soldiers did not enjoy, their political ambitions were crushed. The tiger flag was hauled down from the flagstaff, torn from its halyards, and replaced once again by the Union Jack. The restoration of British authority was visually complete, but the psychological scars of the day would fester. The sheer speed of the violence from the mutiny at dawn to the massacre at noon left both sides in a state of shock. With the fighting effectively over, the atmosphere inside Vellore Fort shifted from the frenetic energy of combat to the cold, administrative brutality of military justice. The afternoon sun beat down on a scene that resembled a charnel house more than a military outpost. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood, the sulphurous stench of spent gunpowder, and the rising heat of the Indian summer, which accelerated the grim reality of the battlefield. For Colonel Rollo Gillespie, the work was not yet done. Though the fort was secure, the message had to be sent, loudly and unmistakably, that mutiny against the East India Company would be met with apocalyptic consequences. There were no long trials or legal deliberations that afternoon. The drumhead court-martials were swift, the verdicts foregone. The surviving mutineers, those who had surrendered or been dragged from their hiding holes, were rounded up in the courtyard. They stood surrounded by the 19th Light Dragoons, whose sabres were still drawn, and the exhausted, vengeful survivors of the 69th Regiment. The retribution that followed was designed to be theatrical in its horror. A psychological weapon intended to terrify any other potential conspirators in the region. The primary instrument of execution was the very artillery that had breached the gate. In a practice known as blowing from a gun, a punishment reserved for mutiny and high treason, select ringleaders were bound across the mouths of the 6-pounder cannons. It was a method of execution deeply feared not just for its violence, but for its spiritual implications, as the total destruction of the body was believed by both Hindus and Muslims to effect the transition to the afterlife. At the order of the officers, the matches were applied. The cannons roared one final time that day, not at an approaching enemy, but at the bound prisoners. The result was instantaneous and total, scattering the remains across the parade ground in a gruesome display of imperial power. Others were lined up against the bullet-pocked walls of the fort and executed by firing squad. The crack of muskets continued well into the afternoon, punctuating the silence that had otherwise fallen over the city. By the time the guns finally went cold, the rebellion had been not just defeated, but obliterated. The bodies of the mutineers were carted away, unceremoniously disposed of in mass graves outside the fort walls. The message had been delivered. The British Raj, though shaken, held the power of life and death. In the days that followed, the investigation into the causes of the slaughter began to peel back the layers of the conspiracy. It became clear that this was not merely a military revolt, but a cultural collision. The new turban, that round hat with the leather cockade, was identified as the primary catalyst. To the rigid military mind of Commander-in-Chief Sir John Cradock, it was a simple uniform update for the sake of smartness and uniformity. To the sepoys, it was a leather-bound symbol of defilement, a surreptitious attempt to break their caste and force them into Christianity. The banning of caste marks and beards had only poured fuel on this fire. The irony was bitter. Nearly 1,000 men had died, and the stability of British India had been risked over a piece of headgear. The consequences for the instigators were severe. The sons of Tipu Sultan, whose presence in Vellore had provided the magnetic north for the mutiny's moral compass, were permanently removed from the region. The British could not afford to execute royalty and risk a wider war, so the princes were exiled to Calcutta, thousands of miles away from their power base in Mysore. They would live out their days as pensioners, stripped of influence, their dream of a resurrected sultanate buried in the dust of Vellore. As for the controversial dress code, the company acted with rare pragmatism. The order for the new turban was rescinded. The caste marks and beards were allowed to return. The British had won the battle, but they tacitly admitted defeat in the Cultural War, realizing that pushing the sepoys too far on matters of faith was a recipe for suicide. As the sun finally set on July 10, 1806, Vellore Fort stood as a grim monument to the fragility of imperial power. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the psychological shockwaves rippled all the way back to London. In the span of roughly 14 hours, the East India Company had stared into the abyss of total collapse in southern India. The swift and brutal intervention of Colonel Rollo Gillespie had saved the day, transforming a potential catastrophe into a decisive, albeit bloody, victory. For his actions, Gillespie became the toast of British India, celebrated as the hero of Vellore. His ride from Arcot and his scaling of the walls became legendary exploits, cementing his reputation as one of the most daring cavalry commanders of his generation. He would go on to die as he lived, storming a fortress in Nepal several years later. But his legacy was forever tethered to that singular day in the Carnatic. The regiments involved bore the scars and the honours of the day. The 69th Regiment of Foot, though battered and decimated in the initial ambush, had held the line just long enough to prevent the fort from falling entirely. Their discipline on the ramparts had been the anvil against which Gillespie's hammer had struck. The 19th Light Dragoons, the terrors of the East, had proven the devastating efficacy of European heavy cavalry in a shock roll, even within the confines of a fortress. Yet, beneath the medals and the accolades, a disturbing truth lingered. The Vellore Mutiny was not an isolated incident of indiscipline. It was a seismic tremor predicting a coming earthquake. The specific grievances that triggered the violence, the leather cockades, the shaving of beards, the fear of forced Christianization, were remarkably specific, yet they spoke to a universal anxiety among the sepoy armies. The British, in their drive for efficiency and uniformity, had failed to understand the complex web of religious and social identity that bound their native troops. They had treated the sepoys as military machines to be standardized, rather than men with deep-rooted spiritual convictions. In the aftermath, the East India Company undertook a massive cover-up of sorts. While the specific regulations were withdrawn, the structural blindness remained. The lesson of Vellore, that religious insensitivity could turn loyal soldiers into revolutionaries overnight, was learned, and then, over the course of the next half-century, slowly forgotten. A complacency settled over the Raj. The assumption grew that Vellore was an anomaly, a freak occurrence driven by the specific machinations of Tipu Sultan's sons, rather than a systemic failure of British governance. 51 years later, in 1857, the ghosts of Vellore would rise again, but on a scale that would dwarf the events of 1806. The Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, would be triggered by an eerily similar grievance: the introduction of the Enfield rifle and the rumour of greased cartridges made from cow and pig fat. Just as the leather cockade had sparked the fire in Vellore, the greased cartridge would ignite the entire subcontinent. The difference was that in 1857, there would be no Rollo Gillespie to crush the uprising in a single morning. The mutiny would spread like wildfire, leading to years of bloodshed, the end of the East India Company, and the restructuring of the entire British Empire. Vellore serves as a haunting prologue to this larger tragedy. It stands as a what-if moment in history. Had the 69th Regiment failed to hold the walls for those critical hours, or had Gillespie been delayed on the road from Arcot, the Tiger flag might have flown over South India for years, altering the trajectory of global history. Instead, the rebellion was crushed in a single day, preserved in the archives as a violent, successful police action. Today, the granite walls of Vellore Fort still stand, silent and imposing over the bustling city. The moat is still there, though the crocodiles are long gone. It remains a silent witness to a day of incredible bravery and terrible slaughter, a moment when the British Empire nearly lost its jewel, only to save it with a rope, a sword, and a charge of light dragoons. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.